All right, so welcome back again today. It's good to be with you, and I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about how couples can be successful in resolving differences that they have in their relationship. And of course, this is a topic that impacts almost every couple. I would dare say every couple in the world. And I want to talk with you a little bit today about some strategies, some tactics that you can use to work through those differences in your relationship. So stay tuned. Okay, so resolving differences. Let's jump into that topic a little bit. And what I have here behind me is a slide out of our Resolving Differences video course. If you haven't checked out our video courses yet, I would highly recommend it. I go into a lot more detail about this topic in the Resolving Differences video course, and you can check that out along with all of our other video courses at the link that I'll share in the information below. So check that out, and I think you'll find that highly impactful and effective for your relationship. But there's a component in that principle that I wanted to talk about today. So what I have behind me is a couple, and the couple is separated by some differences in their relationship. So they're not connected on this slide. You'll see that there's quite a gap between the two of them on this slide. And they have a difference that's going on in their relationship that they're having some conflict over. And you'll notice that on this slide, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum between strongly for, slightly for, or neutral, and then slightly against and strongly against. And what this spectrum is showing is that there's multiple places that we can stand on any given topic, right? When any difference that we have in the relationship, there's a spectrum of places that we can stand. Anywhere from strongly against to strongly for, right? And because of that, when a couple sees a situation or a decision the same, they very rarely have conflict over it because they're standing in the same place on that issue. But when they see something different, when they have differing opinions or differing needs, differing preferences, differing hopes, right? They can sometimes find quite a large gap between where they're standing. And those gaps present opportunities for conflict. If we're not careful, those gaps can create injury. They can create hurt in the relationship. They can create misunderstanding, and they can cause a couple to feel disconnect in their relationship. Too many of those dynamics in their relationship, too many of those gaps stacked up kind of on top of each other can lead to a situation where a couple oftentimes in their relationship feels pain and understanding or misunderstanding and frustration in their relationship because all these gaps are creating disconnect in their relationship and they don't know how to work through them and resolve them. So that's what we're going to talk about today, how to close that gap. So think about in your relationship any issue that you could have that's creating distance and disconnect, right? And there's lots of them. Sometimes that issue is finances. The couples see a financial decision differently than one another. They have different hopes or different priorities with the money, right? And so they're standing in two different places trying to figure out how to resolve it. Sometimes it's intimacy, right? The couple has different intimacy preferences, frequency preferences for their physical intimacy, right? And as a result of that, they're standing in two different places, two different needs, two different preferences in the intimacy. Sometimes it's parenting. Sometimes it's a parental difference, right? That we see something with our children differently than one another. And so we're standing in different places. Whatever that dynamic is, think of what yours is. Think of one that you're in two different places. You kind of see it different than one another, right? The next thing that you want to do once you identify what that difference is you want to ask yourself the question, where do I stand on this continuum? Right? Because there's lots of places that I can stand either for or against, like strongly for, slightly for, neutral, slightly against, strongly against, right? So there's lots of places I can stand, and it's important to ask yourself, where do I stand? Because if you don't ask yourself, where do I stand, you might actually take a stronger stance than you actually feel, right? Sometimes we're not sure how we feel yet, so we just take a really strong oppositional stance to wherever our partner is, which really isn't fair to the problem resolution, right? Because our partner might have a well thought out reason that they're standing where they are, and I haven't thought much about it, but I'm not ready to make a decision, so I just take a strong opposing stance, right? So we want to ask ourselves, where do I stand? The other reason you want to ask yourself, where do you stand, is because sometimes we tend to stand in strong places, right, on opposite sides of the spectrum. We tend to stand in these really opinionated, really strong places too frequently over too many topics that don't actually need me to take that kind of a strong stance on. And anytime I take a strong stance on either side of this continuum, right, anytime I take a really strong stance on an issue, it makes it hard for there to be room for another view or another preference or another need or another desire, right? Because I'm taking such a strong stance, it leaves very little room for you as my partner to take a different stance, right? Because I'm so strongly opinionated all the time, right? So if you are going to take a different stance, we might have conflict, right? And sometimes my partner's forced to join me way more than they should have to because they want to avoid conflict, right? So that's the other reason it's important to ask myself, where do I stand? Because if I find that I'm standing in really opinionated, really strong places on almost every topic, everything from where should we eat today to how should we spend our tax return. if I'm always strongly opinionated, it makes it very difficult for my spouse to be connected to me and have a different view than me, right? The goal is that oftentimes I can spend time here in these slight places, slightly for, slightly against, or neutral. And in those places, I'm much more malleable, I'm much more flexible. I can join my partner easier if they have a different opinion than mine, right? Which is the goal always with all these gaps. The goal is to try to figure out, how do we bring the relationship together? How do we resolve this difference by drawing closer together, right? That's the goal always. So think about what your gap is, right? That you're going to apply to this, and ask yourself the question, where do I stand? And where does my partner stand? Now, some signs that I stand in really strong places is I feel emotionally very strong about this topic, right? Oftentimes I've thought it through well. It may represent some core values of mine, important preferences of mine, right, that are showing up in this relationship, right? So those are sometimes signs that I'm in a strong place. I feel desire to defend my stance, and maybe even to demand that my spouse join me in my stance, right? It really builds up a lot of emotion for me. That can be one indicator that I'm in one of these strong places, right? Versus a slight or neutral space, I'm going to feel a lot less emotionality, right? My emotions aren't going to get so riled up about this topic. I'm going to feel more kind of like, well, I could kind of go either way. I mean, I think I'm slightly on this side of the issue, just simply for these reasons. But, if you feel strongly different, I could kind of join you there, right? So that's kind of a neutral stance, maybe slight for or slight against. So the emotion can really tell you a lot about where am I standing on this issue. The stronger the emotion, probably the more severe stance that I'm taking on this topic. And the more thought out my thoughts are, right? If I kind of do a pros cons list in my mind and I have lots of reasons for or against and only a few, right, that are the opposite, I'm probably in one of these strong places versus kind of an equal list, kind of closer pros and cons to each other. So again, finding out, where do I stand? Am I strongly for? Am I slightly for? Am I neutral? Am I slightly against, or am I strongly against, right? Where do I stand? And asking yourself, where does my partner stand as well? So you kind of have an idea of where you are. Now, I'm guessing if you thought of a situation in your relationship that there's a gap, it probably represents a gap like this. Because usually the most troublesome gaps that we have, right, the ones that you might watch a video like this to try to figure out how to resolve, are ones where we both feel very strong opinions about the topic, right? So let's say that the issue that we feel really strongly different about is giving our children a allowance, right? Let's say that's the topic. So let's say that he is strongly for the idea of giving an allowance, and that there shouldn't be any strings attached, right? That there should just be a set amount of money each week that they give as an allowance to help the children learn to budget. And let's say she's in this other place, this strongly against place, that she doesn't think the allowance is wise, right? That she thinks they ought to earn every cent that they make, and that no allowance should be given, right? That most things should be paid for by them as parents until the children get older, and no allowance should occur, right? So they have this gap, and they've got several children that are getting a little bit older, approaching those teen years, that they're starting this debate starting to heat up more and more. And of course, the kids throw in their opinions, and that complicates this, right? So he's strongly for the allowance, and she's strongly against the allowance, right? And it seems as though there's going to be this butting of heads. There already has been, right? And maybe even some accusations and some defenses that are going on that are causing some hurt and some pain, some discord in the relationship, right? So here's the situation that the couple's in. Now there's a couple of things, if we're going to do this well, if we're going to resolve this difference well, there's a few principles that we've got to keep in mind, right? So the first one is, and I'm listing up here on the slide, is that we want to advocate about why we're standing where we're standing, which is different, right, than wanting to demand that you join me where I'm standing. Now think about that difference, right? I want to advocate the reason that I'm standing where I am versus demand that you join me where I stand, right? So when I advocate for myself, think about that difference. What does that mean to advocate for myself, right? And you could look that up definitionally, right? To advocate for myself. To advocate for myself typically means that I'm going to explain to you the reasons that I stand where I stand. I'm going to try to share with you how I came to that conclusion. And I'm going to do it with advocacy versus demanding, right? So that typically sends a message that I'm going to be patient in my effort to explain to you. I'm going to try to be thorough in my efforts to explain to you. I'm going to have respect in the ways that I explain to you, right? I'm going to try to use positive communication strategy to explain and maybe even convince, try to convince or persuade you to understand and see things the way that I see them. I'm going to advocate for myself and for my stance. Very different than I'm going to jump in and make demands of you, right? I think we ought to do, we ought to give the money every week, right? The allowance should be a right of every child. And I think you're idiotic for not thinking that with me, right? So that's very demanding, and that's very critical of my partner. And we're trying to advocate, which might sound a little bit more like, you know what? I've given a lot of thought to this allowance thing, and I really think we ought to do the allowance, and here's the reasons why, right? One of the big ones is they're not quite old enough to go work outside of the house, right? And I want them to be able to have the experience of working a little bit and getting some money, right? And so I think this allowance could be a great way to do that, to start to learn how to budget, to start to learn how to balance a bank account, right? To start to figure out, how to, spend money. They're getting old enough that having a little bit of extra money could be good, right? So for these reasons, I really feel like this allowance is important, right? So to advocate in that tone versus to demand in the other tone, that's kind of just like, look, this is how it should be. I think your idea not to do this is dumb, right? Like, you're never going to convince me. We need to do the allowance, right? So demanding. And then as our partner is sharing, right, we want to consider versus defend, right? So oftentimes when there's this gap, I want to demand and defend. And when you think about defend, right, my partner might share their view, and I'm listening to their view, right? So in this stance, right, she's saying, that I don't think that the allowance is appropriate at all, right? No free money should be given to our kids, right? And I don't think we should do an allowance at all. They need to get a job and work if they want money, right? So in that place, as she's sharing, it would be easy for him to be defensive. And we become defensive when we listen to our partner, when he's listening to her from a stance of defending himself versus listening to her for understanding. Now, we go over this principle a lot in advanced communication strategy, right? And you can take a look at this principle as well in our video course, Maintaining Intimacy and Sex, the part 1 of that video course, right? So both of those talk about communication style, how to build emotional intimacy, right? This idea of listening for understanding versus listening to defend, right? So we want to be careful not to defend. Is my partner sharing her stance about how she feels like there should be no free money, right? We want to listen to understand where she's at. We want to try to consider, right, why she's standing where she is and what the good points are that she might be making in this interaction. And I want to try to consider on the same level that I hope she'll consider my view. I want to give the same consideration to her that I'm hoping she'll give to me, right? So we're trying to communicate from an advocacy place, right? To advocate for where I am, which is to try to, explain and walk you through and persuade, right? Like from my angle, the way that I see it, and to do that with respect, to do that with patience, to do that with humility, right? And then as you're sharing where your stance is, I want to try to consider, to be open to evaluate, right? Honestly, with an open mind, why you are where you are and what good points you may have for why you're standing where you are that I maybe haven't considered. And I want to try to give you that consideration on the same level that I hope you'll give me that consideration. And when a couple can do this, when they can advocate and consider back and forth, right? Sharing from a respectful, calm place and listening to try to understand from a respectful and calm place, back and forth, sometimes they'll find that one of them might start to move toward the middle, right? That she might say, you know what, you've got some really good ideas about the budgeting thing. I hadn't really thought about that before, right? So that makes me, I'm still not sure about, this whole allowance idea. We never had it growing up, but I do like what you're saying about the budget thing, right? Or as he's listening and really trying to consider her stance, he may start to move this way a little bit too, like I can see how maybe it could create some entitlement in our children. What you're saying, if we just kind of give them free money, that maybe they'll start to feel entitled, and maybe they won't really learn a good work ethic if we make it too easy for them to get money, right? And so he might start moving toward the middle a little bit, and they're only going to do that if they're really honestly considering the good viewpoints, the good points that the other may have that they haven't really looked at, and if they're advocating with respect. When we demand, we typically promote defensiveness, right? When we advocate, it's easier to consider my view. And if we do that respectfully, seeing each other as my partner in life, you're not my enemy, right? You're not the person for me to overcome and take control of, right? You're not the burden or the obstacle in my way. You're my partner, right? And the difference that we have is over this allowance thing. And together, we want to figure out how to work through that difference, right? When we can come from that viewpoint, you are my partner, and I want to advocate with you, and I want to consider your view. When you have two people that are willing to do that, sometimes you'll notice that one or the other will start to say, you know what, you have some good points I hadn't thought of. I'm still leaning to the side of, I don't know that we need to make it so easy for them, but maybe we should do an allowance, right? You might start to see one partner or the other joining, which is wonderful, right? As often as we can join each other, the better, right? Now, sometimes we just can't get on the same page, right? Sometimes the difference represents something important enough to me that I want to stay kind of firmly standing where I'm standing in the relationship. And we hope that those situations, that you're picking those battles with high priority, that they're not just loosey-goosey, where should we eat today type strong stances all the time, right? That once in a while we encounter one that we both just see very differently. And when we do that, the goal becomes to develop a win-win, right? So we've got down in here to compromise. This is where compromise is extremely important. And in order to pull off an effective compromise, you need to have listened to each other enough to understand the really important pieces for your partner and them for you, right? Because a compromise is trying to come up with a third option, right? So the first option is give an allowance. The second option was don't give an allowance, right? And we want to come up with, is there a third option, right? Is there a third option that's not necessarily the ideal for either party, but it's a compromise enough of the things that are important to them that they can come together over that third option, right? So what might be a compromise for us? And when you think about for this couple, what could that compromise be, right? What could that compromise be for this couple? So let's say that this couple came up with the idea, it's like, okay, I don't feel awesome about an allowance, but you feel really strongly about it. And from what I can gather, you feel really strongly about it because you want our children to be able to have some access to money, to start to learn to budget, to start to learn prioritization and spending, right? To have some of that responsibility. And I kind of like that idea, right? I don't really love the idea of giving them free money, but I do like that idea. And I get what you're saying too, that they're not quite old enough to work outside of the house. So maybe what we can do is come up with some regimented chores, some jobs, right, in our home where they can earn money, right? And we can come up with a reasonable amount to pay them per job or per hour that they work, right, as if they have a job in our home, and still accomplish your goal for them having money and learning how to budget and learning how to prioritize spending, right? So they're coming up with this win-win idea, right? This third option that incorporates things that are important to both, right? She's concerned about the entitlement and them maybe not learning to work for money, right? And giving away, free money, she thinks will cause more issue than good. And he's really concerned about them learning how to budget. And so with this third option, right, they're finding a win-win compromise that they both can get behind. It's not really the ideal that they started out with, but it incorporates enough of both of their needs that they can come together for this win-win, right? So pause and think about your difference, right? I asked you earlier to think about what's one of these gaps that you have in your relationship where you're standing in strong places opposite to your partner. And ask yourself the question, have you really advocated about that issue, right? Not just demanded, not just strongly stated your case, not just criticized the lack of wisdom in your partner's stance, right? Like, have you really advocated your stance? So think about that, right? That definition of humbly, gently, patiently, trying to explain, trying to persuade, right? Like trying to walk them through how you got to where you are. Have you done that, right? And if you haven't done that, try that. The other question is, have you considered, right? Have you really offered consideration to them, the same as you're hoping that they'll offer to you, right? Or have you just kind of listened impatiently and with defensiveness and formulated kind of a critical response to why their idea is dumb, right? So have you really considered, right? Considered enough that you can start to see ways in which you could compromise. And if you can't see ways to compromise, it probably means you haven't considered enough, right? Or you haven't heard enough from them. You haven't encouraged them to advocate with you enough to really understand what you could consider, what you could offer consideration to in developing kind of this third option, right? So ask yourself those questions and go back and try to invite the conversation again with your partner and let them know, look, I don't want to fight. I really just want to try to understand you better. You obviously see this differently than me, and I really want to try to understand you better. Now, they may not deliver their stance real well. If they haven't watched our advanced communication strategy video course, they may not deliver their stance really well. They may not advocate well. They may demand and criticize much more than advocate, right? So try to be patient with that, right? Try to be humble, try to be patient, try to be long-suffering, gentle, right? In your listening, your goal is to try to consider things that you could compromise over, right? And then as you share, try to do it better. Try to share from a place that's much more advocating, right? Than demanding and critical. Don't just join them in a critical, demanding approach, right? You might even be able to model for them. Don't tell them, hey, by the way, now I'm going to show you the best way to do this. That might not go off well, right? But in your mind, try to model for them a better example of what advocacy can look like, right? And your goal in that conversation is just to understand better what their needs are, what their preferences are, what their hopes are, so that you can consider them as you're also sharing about yours to try to come up with some third option solutions, right? And the third option should incorporate the most meaningful things for you and the most meaningful parts for me. We're trying to take those and combine them into an option that may not be the ideal for either one of us, but incorporates our needs enough that we can both get behind the third option, right? We can finally close that gap and go forward on this topic in a healthier way. So that's your challenge, right? Take that and work to apply that. Now, if you haven't already, right, like us, subscribe to us, share this content. We are on a mission to help couples everywhere thrive. We want to bring fulfillment and joy to relationship. We want to work against the terrible statistics for failed marriages, right? Our goal is to strengthen couples everywhere. And we hope that you found this content helpful today. So you take care of yourself, and I look forward to being with you again soon.